The sharp crack of Karen Whitmore's tennis racket hitting the morning air like a suburban war cry was nothing compared to the thunderous crash that would soon echo through the Platinum Heights development when she discovered that harassing Hollywood legends over garbage placement becomes very expensive when that legend's assistant has a background in military engineering and access to industrial-grade concrete mixing equipment. But here's the thing about entitled HOA presidents who wear pristine white tennis outfits like battle armor and treat municipal waste management like personal vendettas. They never expect to meet someone whose idea of problem-solving involves transforming a simple trash receptacle into an immovable monument to the consequences of suburban bullying. By the time I finished documenting her systematic harassment campaign and psychological warfare tactics, this tennis-obsessed suburban dictator had destroyed her own luxury vehicle, faced criminal charges for property destruction, and learned the hard way that some people don't just file complaints, they build solutions that make physics textbooks jealous. Seriously, what would you do if some HOA Karen made it her personal mission to demolish your trash can every single morning while you're trying to maintain a peaceful retirement? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I need to see if this level of garbage-related insanity exists in your neighborhood too. Let me back up and explain how this whole engineering nightmare started. My name is Michael Thompson, and I've been Robert Redford's personal assistant and security coordinator for 7 years. When you work for someone whose career spans 5 decades of legendary filmmaking, environmental activism, and whose Utah ranch operates as both a creative sanctuary and ecological research center, you learn to expect requests that range from screening scripts to coordinating with wildlife conservation organizations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for dealing with Karen Whitmore and her pathological obsession with controlling every aspect of waste management in the Platinum Heights luxury development. Robert had purchased his winter residence in Platinum Heights 18 months ago, a stunning 8,400 square foot contemporary home on 4 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds that offered both privacy and accessibility for someone who valued solitude but needed occasional proximity to Los Angeles for business meetings and industry events. At 78, Robert had earned the right to spend his mornings reading scripts on his terrace without worrying about suburban politics or neighborhood drama. Karen Whitmore, meanwhile, lived 3 houses down in a $4.2 million Mediterranean villa that she'd transformed into the unofficial command center for what she considered her personal kingdom. At 35, Karen had the kind of restless energy that comes from having enough inherited wealth to be dangerous, but not enough life experience to understand that money doesn't grant authority over other people's garbage. Picture this. Karen's daily uniform consisted of pristine white tennis outfits that looked like they'd been pressed by military personnel. Not a wrinkle, not a stain, not a thread out of place. Her platinum blonde hair was always styled in what expensive salons call the country club executive, precisely layered, professionally colored, and hairsprayed into a helmet that could probably deflect small projectiles. She carried a white leather tennis bag everywhere, even when she wasn't headed to the courts, like some kind of suburban status symbol that announced her membership in the leisure class to anyone within a 50-yard radius. Karen's morning routine was legendary throughout Platinum Heights for all the wrong reasons. She'd emerge from her mansion at exactly 6:45 a.m., wearing her tennis whites and designer sunglasses, driving her pristine white Range Rover Sport on what she called community oversight patrols that involved documenting any deviation from her personal interpretation of neighborhood aesthetics and municipal ordinances. As president of the Platinum Heights HOA, Karen wielded her authority like a medieval queen, ruling over peasant subjects who existed solely for her approval or condemnation. She'd spent the past 4 years systematically expanding her control beyond reasonable HOA governance into comprehensive lifestyle management for residents who'd made the mistake of buying homes in her domain. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in October, when Robert's garbage collection schedule coincided with Karen's patrol route in a way that would transform routine waste disposal into a suburban war that lasted 6 months and ended with federal charges. Here's where the geography becomes crucial to understanding this story. Robert's property sits on a corner lot with a circular driveway that requires trash collection from the street-facing curb rather than a more discreet alley pickup. The city ordinance specifies that garbage containers must be placed within 3 feet of the curb by 6 a.m. on collection days and removed by 8 p.m. the same day. Robert's housekeeper, Maria Santos, had been following this routine perfectly for over a year without any issues. She'd place the regulation garbage container at the designated spot every Tuesday and Friday morning, and the city crew would collect it without incident. The system worked flawlessly until Karen decided that Robert's garbage placement violated her aesthetic vision for the neighborhood. The first incident occurred on October 15th, when I was reviewing scripts with Robert on his back terrace. We heard what sounded like a minor traffic accident, the sharp crash of metal hitting concrete followed by the distinct sound of something large rolling down a hill. When we investigated, we discovered that Robert's garbage container had been knocked over, spilling coffee grounds, script drafts, and household waste across the pristine sidewalk and landscaping. Maria was mortified. She spent 40 minutes cleaning up the mess while apologizing profusely for what she assumed was a simple accident caused by wind or an animal. I helped her gather the scattered debris, and we repositioned the container with more stable placement to prevent future incidents. The second incident happened 3 days later, on Friday morning. Same sound, same result, same cleanup process. But this time, I noticed something interesting: tire marks on the curb that suggested a vehicle had deliberately struck the garbage container rather than accidentally colliding with it. By the third incident the following Tuesday, I was conducting surveillance from Robert's security room, which offered a clear view of the street through high-definition cameras that we'd installed for general property security. What I recorded would become crucial evidence in multiple criminal and civil proceedings. At precisely 6:47 a.m., Karen's white Range Rover Sport approached the garbage container at what appeared to be normal speed. Then, as she drew alongside it, she suddenly swerved directly into the container, striking it with enough force to send it flying across the sidewalk while spilling its contents across a 20-foot radius. Karen didn't stop to assess the damage or offer assistance. She simply continued her patrol route as if deliberately destroying someone's property was part of her morning routine. The video clearly showed her face through the windshield, her expression calm and satisfied as she drove away from the destruction she'd caused. I immediately called the police and filed a report for property destruction and reckless driving. Officer Rodriguez arrived within 20 minutes and reviewed the security footage with the kind of professional attention that told me he'd dealt with HOA-related incidents before. "Mr. Thompson, this is clearly intentional property destruction," he confirmed after watching the video 3 times. "We'll file charges for vandalism and reckless driving, but I should warn you that HOA disputes can escalate quickly if not handled properly." His advice was both prophetic and inadequate. Karen's response to being cited for property destruction was to escalate her harassment campaign from petty vandalism to systematic psychological warfare that would make military strategists nervous about suburban women with too much time and too little supervision. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from the Platinum Heights HOA demanding immediate correction of ongoing waste management violations that compromise community aesthetic standards. The letter, obviously written by Karen herself, claimed that Robert's garbage placement violated 17 different HOA covenants and municipal ordinances. The documentation she provided was impressive in its creative interpretation of property law and waste management regulations. She'd researched every possible angle: container size restrictions, placement timing requirements, aesthetic compatibility standards, and even noise pollution concerns related to garbage collection activities. But buried in the legal language was the real message. Karen intended to use her HOA authority to make Robert's life miserable until he either moved away or submitted to her complete control over his property management decisions. Her first official action was requiring pre-approval for all garbage placement activities, including detailed scheduling forms that had to be submitted 48 hours in advance. Her second action was implementing community aesthetic reviews for any containers or waste management equipment that would be visible from public areas. The forms she created were masterpieces of bureaucratic harassment disguised as community governance. They required detailed descriptions of garbage content, estimated collection times, environmental impact assessments, and even photographic documentation of proper container positioning. When I showed the paperwork to Robert, his reaction was characteristically thoughtful and ominous in its implications. "Michael, I've dealt with studio executives, federal regulators, and environmental activists for 50 years, but I've never encountered someone who thinks they have authority over how I dispose of my garbage." He paused, reviewing the forms with the kind of attention he usually reserved for complex film contracts. "This woman isn't interested in community standards. She's interested in control. And people who abuse authority usually don't stop until someone makes them stop." That evening, I began researching Karen's background and discovered that Robert wasn't her first target. Over the past 4 years, she'd systematically harassed 6 different homeowners through creative interpretation of HOA rules and municipal ordinances. 3 families had sold their homes and moved rather than deal with her ongoing harassment campaigns. The pattern was always the same: identify some minor violation of her personal interpretation of community standards, escalate enforcement through increasingly demanding paperwork and inspections, then maintain pressure until the targets either submitted completely to her authority or abandoned their homes. But Karen had made a crucial error in targeting Robert. She'd assumed that celebrities would be easier targets than regular homeowners because they'd want to avoid negative publicity and community conflict. What she didn't understand was that Robert had spent decades dealing with much more sophisticated forms of harassment and intimidation than suburban HOA presidents could imagine. More importantly, she'd underestimated my background in military engineering and my experience with creative problem-solving under hostile conditions. While Karen was busy filing paperwork and scheduling inspections, I was researching municipal codes, consulting with concrete contractors, and developing what would become known throughout Platinum Heights as the Thompson solution to suburban harassment. The war between Karen's bureaucratic authority and Robert's right to peaceful enjoyment of his property was about to escalate from paperwork harassment to engineering demonstration, and Karen was completely unprepared for the kind of creative problem-solving that turns simple trash containers into monuments to the consequences of suburban bullying. Karen's bureaucratic warfare escalated faster than her white Range Rover hitting garbage containers, transforming routine waste management into a comprehensive harassment campaign that would make federal prosecutors interested in civil rights violations and suburban terrorism charges. But here's the thing about entitled HOA presidents who mistake clipboard authority for actual power while wearing tennis outfits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. They never realize that systematic harassment creates evidence trails that defense attorneys can't explain away, especially when their targets have the resources to document everything and the patience to let bullies destroy themselves through escalating criminal behavior. The crisp autumn air carried the sound of Karen's designer tennis shoes clicking across her marble foyer as she prepared what she called comprehensive compliance enforcement protocols, completely unaware that every form she created and every demand she issued was building the foundation for her own legal destruction. The certified letter demanding pre-approval for garbage placement was just Karen's opening move in what would become the most comprehensively documented harassment campaign in Platinum Heights history. Within 48 hours of receiving the police citation for property destruction, she'd transformed her dining room into a war room complete with property surveys, municipal code books, and surveillance equipment that would make private investigators nervous. Karen's escalation strategy was methodical and legally dubious. She began conducting compliance inspections of Robert's property at 6:30 a.m. every Tuesday and Friday, arriving in her white Range Rover with a clipboard, digital camera, and measuring tape to document what she claimed were ongoing violations of community standards. The inspection reports she generated were masterpieces of creative legal interpretation disguised as official documentation. She measured garbage container placement to the quarter-inch, photographed shadows cast by the container at different times of day, and recorded detailed observations about the aesthetic impact of waste management activities on community property values. But Karen's most audacious move was establishing what she called the Platinum Heights Community Standards Enforcement Division, a fictional municipal authority that existed only in her imagination but sounded official enough to intimidate residents who didn't research her claims. The fake enforcement notices she began issuing looked legitimate at first glance, complete with official-sounding citations, fine schedules, and deadlines for compliance. She'd researched municipal letterhead designs and legal language to create documents that appeared to come from actual government agencies rather than one delusional HOA president with access to a computer and printer. Her first official notice demanded immediate payment of $347 in aesthetic impact fees for Robert's garbage placement activities over the past 6 months. The second notice threatened property liens for ongoing violations of municipal waste management ordinances. The third notice claimed that Robert's repeated violations had triggered enhanced enforcement protocols requiring daily inspections and weekly compliance reports. When I showed the fraudulent documents to Robert, his reaction was characteristically measured but ominous in its legal implications. "Michael, this woman has escalated from petty harassment to systematic fraud," he said, reviewing Karen's fake enforcement notices with the attention he usually reserved for complex film contracts. "She's impersonating government officials and threatening property liens based on fictional legal authority. This isn't HOA overreach anymore, this is criminal conspiracy." That's when I decided to implement what would become known as the Thompson Documentation Protocol, comprehensive evidence collection that would capture every aspect of Karen's harassment campaign for eventual federal prosecution. I installed additional security cameras to monitor all approaches to Robert's property, upgraded our recording systems to capture high-definition video with audio, and began maintaining detailed logs of every interaction, every fake enforcement notice, and every instance of property destruction that Karen committed. But documentation alone wasn't enough. Karen's morning garbage container attacks were continuing despite the police citation, and her fake enforcement activities were creating stress for Robert that was affecting his ability to enjoy his retirement sanctuary. That's when my military engineering background suggested a solution that would combine problem-solving with evidence creation in a way that would make Karen's harassment campaign backfire spectacularly. The idea was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Instead of continuing to replace damaged garbage containers, I would design and build a container that could withstand Karen's vehicular attacks while documenting her escalating criminal behavior. I contacted Dale Morrison, a concrete contractor who specialized in decorative installations for luxury properties. Dale's reaction to my specifications was immediate enthusiasm mixed with professional curiosity. "Michael, you want me to build a garbage container that can stop a Range Rover?" he asked, reviewing my engineering drawings with obvious delight. "That's not waste management, that's fortification engineering disguised as municipal compliance." The design I developed was based on military bunker construction principles adapted for suburban use. The foundation would extend 4 feet underground with steel reinforcement rods connecting to a concrete base that weighed 3,200 pounds when cured. The visible portion would look like a standard residential garbage enclosure, but it would be constructed with reinforced concrete thick enough to stop small vehicles while maintaining the aesthetic appearance required by municipal codes. The total cost was $4,700, a significant investment in suburban warfare, but reasonable for creating a monument to the consequences of vehicular harassment while providing compelling evidence of Karen's escalating criminal behavior. Dale's team completed the installation over a long weekend, while Karen was attending what her social media posts described as a wellness retreat for community leaders at an expensive spa in Scottsdale. The timing was perfect for creating what would become known throughout Platinum Heights as Fort Garbage, a concrete fortress disguised as routine waste management infrastructure. The finished product was visually indistinguishable from a high-end residential garbage enclosure. Decorative stone facing matched Robert's landscaping, bronze hardware complemented his architectural details, and the overall aesthetic enhanced rather than detracted from the property's appearance. But beneath the attractive exterior was 3,200 pounds of steel-reinforced concrete designed to transfer impact forces directly into the ground rather than allowing movement or damage. The structure was literally immovable by anything short of heavy construction equipment. Karen's return from her spa retreat coincided with the next garbage collection day, setting up what would become the most expensive lesson in physics that Platinum Heights had ever witnessed. At precisely 6:47 a.m. on the Tuesday following her return, Karen emerged from her mansion wearing a fresh white tennis outfit and driving her pristine Range Rover on her usual harassment patrol. The sight of what appeared to be Robert's standard garbage container in its normal location apparently triggered her automatic destruction response. The collision was captured by multiple security cameras from different angles, creating comprehensive documentation of what happened when an unstoppable entitled suburban terrorist met an immovable concrete fortress. Karen approached at her usual speed and swerved into the container with the same force she'd used to destroy previous garbage receptacles. But instead of sending the container flying, her Range Rover absorbed the entire impact against 3,200 pounds of reinforced concrete that didn't move so much as a millimeter. The sound was spectacular. The sharp crash of expensive German engineering meeting superior American concrete construction. Karen's airbags deployed, her windshield spider-webbed, and her front bumper crumpled like expensive aluminum foil while steam began pouring from her radiator. But the concrete fortress remained completely undamaged, sitting exactly where it had been installed, and looking mildly offended by Karen's attempted assault. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the impact. Karen sat in her disabled vehicle for nearly 3 minutes, apparently processing the reality that her harassment weapon had just been neutralized by superior engineering, while creating comprehensive evidence of her criminal behavior. When she finally emerged from her damaged Range Rover, her white tennis outfit was disheveled, her helmet hair was askew, and her designer sunglasses were hanging from one ear like a broken fashion accessory. She walked around the concrete fortress several times, apparently trying to understand how her reliable harassment technique had suddenly stopped working. Then she made the strategic error that would transform this from property destruction into felony assault charges. Instead of accepting defeat and calling for tow truck assistance, Karen decided that the problem wasn't her illegal harassment technique. The problem was that she needed more force. She returned to her damaged vehicle and attempted to back up for another assault on the concrete fortress. Her crumpled bumper was dragging against her front wheels, her headlights were shattered, and steam was still pouring from her engine, but Karen was apparently convinced that a second attack would succeed where the first had failed. The second collision was even more devastating than the first. Karen's already damaged Range Rover struck the immovable concrete with enough force to deploy her airbags again, while completing the destruction of her vehicle's front end. The impact drove her crumpled hood into her windshield and pushed her engine block back into her passenger compartment. But the concrete fortress remained completely undamaged, unmoved, and apparently unimpressed by Karen's escalating vehicular assault. By this point, neighbors throughout Platinum Heights had been awakened by the sound of expensive vehicles being destroyed against immovable objects. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was recording the incident on her phone, while Mr. Chen was calling 911 to report what appeared to be a mentally unstable driver attacking municipal infrastructure with a luxury SUV. Karen's reaction to completely destroying her $90,000 vehicle against a garbage container revealed the full extent of her psychological deterioration and disconnect from reality. Instead of acknowledging that her harassment campaign had backfired catastrophically, she began screaming at the concrete fortress as if it had personally offended her. "This is illegal," she shrieked, pointing at the immovable structure with a manicured finger while her destroyed Range Rover leaked fluids across the pristine street. "This is a trap. This is entrapment. This is terrorism." The irony was beautiful in its completeness. Karen had spent months systematically destroying Robert's property through deliberate vehicular attacks, but when her harassment weapon was neutralized by superior engineering, she immediately claimed that she was the victim of illegal tactics. That's when Officer Rodriguez arrived with backup units and the kind of professional expression that police officers develop when they realize they're dealing with someone who's just committed multiple felonies while creating comprehensive evidence of their own criminal behavior. "Ma'am, step away from your vehicle," he instructed Karen, who was still screaming at the concrete fortress as if volume could overcome physics. "You're being arrested for reckless driving, property destruction, and assault with a deadly weapon." Karen's response to being arrested revealed her complete inability to understand that actions have consequences, especially when those actions involve using vehicles as weapons against people's property. "You can't arrest me," she protested, her white tennis visor now sitting at an angle that made her look like a disheveled suburban warrior. "I'm the HOA president. I'm enforcing community standards. That thing is a public hazard." The thing she was referring to sat exactly where garbage containers were supposed to sit, according to municipal code, looking completely normal except for its complete immunity to vehicular assault. Karen had just destroyed her own vehicle, trying to demolish what appeared to be standard waste management infrastructure. As Officer Rodriguez explained the charges against her, Karen made the final strategic error that would elevate her harassment campaign from misdemeanor property destruction to serious felony charges with potential prison time. "This is discrimination," she screamed loud enough for the growing crowd of neighbors to hear every word. "You're protecting rich celebrities who think they can terrorize honest community leaders with illegal traps and fake garbage containers." The statement, captured on multiple phones and security cameras, revealed that Karen believed celebrities didn't have the same property rights as other citizens, and that her systematic harassment campaign was justified by Robert's professional success and public recognition. Federal civil rights prosecutors would later describe Karen's recorded statements as textbook evidence of bias-motivated harassment and clear admission of systematic targeting based on the victim's protected status as a public figure. As Karen was led away in handcuffs while her destroyed Range Rover was loaded onto a flatbed tow truck, the concrete fortress sat undamaged and unmoved, serving as a monument to the principle that superior engineering always defeats entitled harassment when applied with sufficient patience and documentation. The war between Karen's suburban terrorism and Robert's right to peaceful garbage disposal had just escalated into federal civil rights violations, and Karen was completely unprepared for the consequences of attacking someone who understood both defensive engineering and offensive legal strategy. The county jail booking process transformed Karen Whitmore from tennis club royalty into inmate 24/7 891, faster than her Range Rover had transformed from luxury transportation into expensive scrap metal, but the orange jumpsuit that replaced her pristine white tennis outfit was nothing compared to the federal charges that would soon replace her HOA authority with supervised probation and court-mandated anger management classes. But here's the thing about entitled suburban terrorists who discover that concrete engineering defeats vehicular harassment while creating comprehensive evidence of systematic criminal behavior. They never realize that their arrest is just the beginning of a legal process that will cost them everything they own, while teaching expensive lessons about the difference between HOA bylaws and federal civil rights violations. The harsh fluorescent lighting in the holding cell made Karen's fading spray tan look like old leather, while her attempts to explain community standards enforcement to cellmates who'd been arrested for actual crimes created the kind of educational entertainment that makes criminology professors assign case studies about suburban privilege meeting institutional reality. Karen's arraignment hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning, and her appointed public defender looked like someone who'd drawn the worst possible case assignment in his career. Thomas Martinez had spent 10 years handling routine criminal defense, but nothing had prepared him for a client who'd systematically harassed a Hollywood legend while documenting her own crimes through comprehensive social media posts and recorded statements. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martinez explained during their brief consultation, "you're facing serious charges for assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and systematic harassment. The prosecution has video evidence of you deliberately attacking the victim's property with your vehicle on multiple occasions." Karen's response revealed that her time in county jail had done nothing to improve her understanding of legal reality or personal responsibility. "Mr. Martinez, this is obviously a setup by corrupt celebrities who think they can use fake legal charges to silence honest community leaders. I was enforcing legitimate HOA authority against someone who refuses to follow community standards." Martinez reviewed the evidence against his client with growing despair. Security footage showing deliberate vehicular attacks, recorded statements admitting to systematic targeting, physical evidence including a destroyed $90,000 Range Rover and an undamaged concrete structure that proved the victim's property compliance with all municipal codes. "Ma'am, the evidence shows systematic criminal behavior spanning several months," he explained with the patience that public defenders develop when dealing with delusional clients. "The prosecution is offering a plea agreement for reduced charges if you accept responsibility and agree to community service and anger management counseling." Karen's rejection of the plea offer was immediate and spectacularly ill-advised. "I will not plead guilty to protecting my community from people who think celebrity status grants immunity from neighborhood standards. This case will expose the corruption between rich celebrities and local government officials. Meanwhile, I was coordinating with federal prosecutors who'd taken interest in Karen's case after reviewing the evidence of systematic harassment based on Robert's celebrity status." Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Kim had specialized in civil rights violations for 12 years, and Karen's recorded statements about targeting rich celebrities had triggered federal jurisdiction under hate crime statutes. "Thompson, what we have here is clear evidence of bias-motivated harassment," Attorney Kim explained during our meeting at the federal courthouse. "Your client was systematically targeted because of his protected status as a public figure, and the harassment escalated to physical violence with deadly weapons." She outlined the federal charges that Karen would face in addition to her state criminal case: civil rights violations under federal hate crime laws, conspiracy to interfere with protected activities, and systematic harassment based on the victim's celebrity status. The federal penalties carried potential prison sentences of 15 to 25 years. But Attorney Kim's most significant finding was about the pattern of harassment that Karen had directed against other residents. "We've identified 6 other homeowners who were systematically targeted by Mrs. Whitmore's harassment campaigns. 3 families left the community specifically to escape her activities. This represents organized conspiracy to violate civil rights on a community-wide scale." The federal investigation was expanding beyond Karen's attacks on Robert's property into comprehensive prosecution of what attorneys described as suburban terrorism disguised as community governance. Karen's own HOA meeting minutes and email records provided evidence of systematic targeting campaigns against residents who challenged her authority. While federal prosecutors built their case, Karen was conducting her defense strategy from county jail with the kind of delusional confidence that makes defense attorneys contemplate career changes. Her jailhouse phone calls, monitored by corrections officials, revealed ongoing attempts to organize community support for what she called her political persecution defense. "Patricia, You need to coordinate with the other board members to show unified HOA support for my community protection activities, she instructed her sister during a recorded phone call. This celebrity thinks he can destroy neighborhood leadership through fake legal charges, but community solidarity will expose his corruption. The phone calls, later admitted as evidence in federal court, captured Karen admitting to systematic harassment while attempting to organize witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Her sister's responses revealed that even Karen's family recognized her complete disconnect from reality. "Karen, you destroyed your car attacking someone's garbage container," Patricia replied with obvious exasperation. "There's no community support for your harassment campaign. Most neighbors are embarrassed that you've brought criminal prosecution to Platinum Heights." But Karen's most damaging jailhouse statement came during a call to local television reporter Janet Morrison, apparently believing that media attention would vindicate her harassment campaign. "This case is about whether honest Americans can protect their communities from celebrity corruption," she announced to Morrison's voicemail. "I sacrificed my personal safety to expose how rich celebrities buy legal protection from corrupt government officials." The recorded statement, broadcast on local news and later used in federal court, captured Karen admitting to deliberate criminal behavior while claiming victimization for systematic harassment activities. Defense attorneys would later describe it as the most self-incriminating evidence in recent criminal history. Meanwhile, the concrete fortress continued serving its function as both practical garbage container and monument to the consequences of suburban harassment. The structure had become a local attraction, with neighbors and curiosity seekers stopping to photograph the immovable concrete installation that had ended Karen's vehicular terrorism campaign. Dale Morrison, the contractor who'd built the fortress, reported that his business had received dozens of inquiries from other communities dealing with HOA harassment problems. "People want to know if we can build similar installations to protect their property from neighbor attacks," he explained. Apparently, Karen's case has inspired defensive engineering projects throughout the region. Robert's reaction to becoming an inadvertent symbol of resistance against suburban harassment was characteristically thoughtful and community-minded. "Michael, if our experience can help other families protect themselves from this kind of systematic bullying, then something positive has come from Karen's criminal behavior. He authorized me to create what we called the Defensive Property Engineering Guidelines, a comprehensive manual that documented the technical specifications, legal considerations, and installation procedures for creating harassment-resistant property infrastructure. The guidelines were distributed free to homeowner groups dealing with similar harassment problems, but the most significant impact of Karen's case was the legislative response it triggered at both state and federal levels. The systematic nature of her harassment campaign, combined with the evidence of community-wide targeting based on residents' wealth and celebrity status, prompted congressional hearings about HOA oversight and civil rights protection. Representative Maria Santos, chairwoman of the House Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Constitutional Liberties, used Karen's case as the centerpiece for proposed legislation requiring federal oversight of HOA activities and enhanced penalties for harassment campaigns targeting protected classes. The Whitmore case demonstrates how homeowner associations can become vehicles for systematic harassment and civil rights violations, Representative Santos explained during televised hearings. "We need federal legislation to protect American families from this kind of community-based terrorism." The proposed HOA Accountability Act would require federal monitoring of associations with histories of harassment complaints, mandatory civil rights training for board members, and enhanced criminal penalties for systematic targeting campaigns based on residents' protected characteristics. Karen's response to becoming the poster child for HOA reform legislation was predictably delusional and legally counterproductive. Her jailhouse statement to the congressional subcommittee, submitted through her attorney despite his strong objections, claimed that federal oversight would destroy community self-governance and enable celebrity corruption of neighborhood standards. The statement was entered into the congressional record as evidence of the mindset that federal legislation was designed to address and prevent. As Karen's trial date approached, the evidence against her continued mounting. Security footage from multiple properties documented a systematic campaign of property destruction spanning 8 months. Her own recorded statements provided clear admission of deliberate targeting and criminal intent. Even her destroyed Range Rover served as physical evidence of her escalating violence and complete disregard for public safety. The prosecution's case was so comprehensive that legal experts predicted Karen would receive maximum sentences on all charges, with federal hate crime penalties adding decades to her potential prison time. Her complete lack of remorse and ongoing attempts to justify her harassment campaign made plea negotiations impossible and guaranteed that prosecutors would seek the harshest possible penalties. But Karen's legal troubles were expanding beyond criminal charges. Robert had filed comprehensive civil lawsuits seeking damages for harassment, emotional distress, and the costs of defensive engineering modifications to his property. The civil case included claims for punitive damages designed to deter similar harassment campaigns in other communities. Additional civil lawsuits had been filed by the 6 other families who'd been targeted by Karen's systematic harassment campaigns. The combined damages sought exceeded $12 million, an amount that would bankrupt Karen's family and require liquidation of all assets including her Platinum Heights mansion. The insurance company covering Karen's homeowner's policy had denied coverage for her criminal activities, leaving her personally liable for all damages and legal costs. Her assets, including her home, vehicles, and investment accounts, had been frozen pending resolution of criminal and civil proceedings. As Karen sat in county jail wearing orange jumpsuits instead of white tennis outfits and writing delusional appeals that courts routinely dismissed, the concrete fortress continued serving its function as both practical infrastructure and educational monument to the consequences of suburban harassment. The lesson was comprehensive and expensive. Systematic harassment has criminal consequences that don't disappear when you realize you've targeted someone with better legal resources and superior engineering capabilities. Federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and concrete contractors don't care about your HOA authority or your tennis club memberships when you commit crimes against your neighbor's property and safety. The federal courthouse smelled like marble polish and shattered suburban dreams when Karen Whitmore shuffled through the metal detectors wearing an Orange County jail jumpsuit that clashed spectacularly with her fading blonde highlights, creating the kind of visual metaphor that makes law students study the transformation from community leadership to federal prosecution. But here's the thing about entitled HOA presidents who discover that federal civil rights violations carry mandatory minimum sentences, while their tennis club memberships provide zero legal immunity. They never realize that attacking Hollywood legends over garbage placement creates the kind of precedent-setting cases that Supreme Court justices cite in constitutional law decisions. The harsh courtroom lighting made Karen's prison pallor look like old parchment, while her attempts to explain community standards enforcement to federal prosecutors who specialized in hate crime prosecution created the kind of legal education that defense attorneys use as cautionary tales about clients who insist on representing themselves through delusional manifestos. Federal Judge Patricia Williams had presided over civil rights cases for 15 years. But Karen's systematic harassment campaign represented what legal scholars would later describe as a textbook example of suburban terrorism disguised as community governance. The evidence file contained over 400 pages of documentation, including security footage, recorded phone calls, fake government documents, and Karen's own social media posts that revealed a comprehensive criminal conspiracy spanning multiple years. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Kim's opening statement methodically outlined the scope of Karen's criminal enterprise, while Karen sat at the defendant's table taking notes on a legal pad as if she were attending a community planning meeting rather than her own federal trial. Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant operated a systematic campaign of harassment, intimidation, and violence against multiple residents of Platinum Heights, based solely on their perceived wealth, celebrity status, and willingness to challenge her illegal authority, Kim began, gesturing toward evidence displays that covered 2 walls of the courtroom. The prosecution's case presentation lasted 3 days and included testimony from 9 victims, 4 law enforcement officers, and 3 expert witnesses who explained the psychological impact of systematic harassment on community residents. The evidence painted a devastating picture of Karen's escalating criminal behavior that had transformed a luxury residential community into what prosecutors termed a fiefdom ruled through intimidation and illegal enforcement activities. But the most damaging testimony came from Karen's own sister, Patricia Whitmore, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation with federal investigators. Patricia's testimony revealed the family conversations that had preceded Karen's most serious criminal activities. Karen called me the night before she installed the fake surveillance equipment, Patricia testified, her voice breaking with emotion. She said she was going to teach these entitled celebrities that community standards apply to everyone. I tried to tell her that harassing Robert Redford was insane, but she was convinced that he was part of some conspiracy to destroy traditional American neighborhoods. The testimony revealed that Karen's harassment campaign wasn't spontaneous criminal behavior, It was premeditated conspiracy, based on delusional beliefs about celebrity corruption and community protection that had festered for months before escalating into systematic violence. Karen's defense strategy, conducted primarily by herself after firing her court-appointed attorney, was a masterpiece of legal self-destruction disguised as constitutional advocacy. She'd convinced herself that representing her own case would allow her to expose the truth about celebrity privilege and government corruption, while demonstrating her superior understanding of community law and constitutional rights. Her opening statement to the federal jury was simultaneously delusional and legally catastrophic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about whether honest Americans can protect their communities from people who think fame and money grant immunity from neighborhood standards," she began, apparently unaware that she was confessing to systematic targeting based on protected characteristics. Karen continued her self-incriminating opening statement for 27 minutes, during which she admitted to taking decisive action against residents who threatened community values, described her surveillance activities as necessary intelligence gathering, and claimed that her vehicular attacks on Robert's property were legitimate enforcement of aesthetic standards. Judge Williams interrupted Karen's opening statement multiple times to warn her that she was confessing to federal crimes, but Karen interpreted the judicial warnings as evidence of systemic corruption designed to protect celebrity criminals from community accountability. The cross-examination phase of Karen's trial became what legal observers described as the most comprehensive example of defendant self-destruction in federal court history. Karen had insisted on questioning prosecution witnesses herself, apparently believing that her superior understanding of community standards would expose flaws in the government's case. Her questioning of Robert Redford, who testified about the impact of systematic harassment on his ability to enjoy his retirement property, revealed the full extent of her delusional thinking and complete inability to understand normal human behavior. "Mr. Redford, isn't it true that you purchased your Platinum Heights property specifically to avoid compliance with community standards?" she asked, apparently believing that celebrity status granted immunity from municipal waste management ordinances. Robert's response was measured, professional, and devastating in its simple honesty. "Ma'am, I purchased my home because I wanted a peaceful place to spend time with family and friends. I've always complied with all municipal ordinances and community guidelines. I never expected to be systematically harassed by someone who claimed authority over my garbage disposal activities." Karen's follow-up questions revealed her complete inability to distinguish between legal community governance and criminal harassment. "But didn't you install that concrete trap specifically to hurt innocent community leaders who were trying to maintain neighborhood standards?" "Ma'am, I installed a properly engineered waste container after you destroyed my property multiple times with your vehicle," Robert replied. "The structure complies with all municipal codes and serves its intended function as garbage storage. Your decision to attack it with your car was entirely voluntary." The exchange, broadcast on multiple news networks, captured Karen admitting to systematic property destruction, while claiming that the victim's defensive measures constituted criminal entrapment. Karen's questioning of FBI agent Maria Rodriguez, who'd investigated the systematic harassment campaign, produced even more self-incriminating statements. "Agent Rodriguez, didn't your investigation ignore evidence of celebrity corruption and focus only on my legitimate community protection activities?" Agent Rodriguez's response was professionally devastating. "Ma'am, our investigation documented systematic criminal behavior including property destruction, harassment, fraud, and attempted witness intimidation. We found no evidence of any corruption or criminal activity by Mr. Redford or any other residents you targeted." But Karen's most catastrophic moment came during her own testimony, when she spent 4 hours explaining her community protection philosophy while admitting to every criminal act charged in the federal indictment. "Your Honor, I want the jury to understand that everything I did was necessary to protect honest families from people who think money and fame grant immunity from community responsibility," she testified, apparently unaware that she was confessing to bias-motivated harassment based on protected characteristics. She detailed her surveillance activities, her fake enforcement campaigns, her vehicular attacks on Robert's property, and her attempts to intimidate other residents into supporting her harassment activities. The testimony was so comprehensively self-incriminating that prosecutors didn't need to call rebuttal witnesses. Judge Williams' instructions to the jury were brief and legally decisive. "Ladies and gentlemen, you must determine whether the defendant's admitted actions constitute systematic harassment and civil rights violations as defined by federal law. The defendant has acknowledged engaging in surveillance, property destruction, and intimidation activities. You must decide whether these actions were motivated by bias against the victim's protected characteristics and whether they violated federal civil rights statutes. The jury deliberated for 37 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The foreman, a retired teacher who'd followed the case with obvious fascination and growing horror, delivered the verdicts with the kind of moral clarity that makes federal judges confident in the justice system. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of harassment based on protected characteristics, we find the defendant guilty. On all charges of property destruction, intimidation, and systematic harassment, we find the defendant guilty. Karen's reaction to the guilty verdicts provided her final moment of self-incrimination in federal court. She stood up and addressed the jury directly, apparently believing that volume could overcome legal reality. You've just convicted an innocent American woman for protecting her community from celebrity corruption. This verdict proves that our justice system protects the wealthy and punishes honest citizens who dare to maintain traditional values. Judge Williams ordered bailiffs to restrain Karen while adding contempt of court charges to her already comprehensive criminal record. Her final words before being removed from the courtroom would later be quoted in legal textbooks as an example of defendant psychology and the consequences of delusional thinking in criminal justice settings. This conviction will be overturned when honest Americans learn the truth about celebrity privilege and government corruption. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and federal guidelines indicated that Karen faced potential prison time of 25 to 35 years due to the systematic nature of her crimes, her complete lack of remorse, and her continued threats against victims and law enforcement officials. But Karen's legal troubles were expanding beyond federal criminal charges. The civil lawsuits filed by her harassment victims had been consolidated into a class action seeking $18 million in damages for systematic harassment, emotional distress, and the costs of defensive property modifications that residents had been forced to implement to protect themselves from her criminal activities. The insurance companies covering Karen's property and vehicle policies had filed their own lawsuits seeking recovery of costs related to her criminal activities. Her homeowners association had expelled her and filed suit for damages to community reputation and property values caused by her harassment campaigns. Even her family had abandoned her legal defense. Her sister Patricia filed a restraining order after Karen's conviction, citing threats and harassment related to Patricia's cooperation with federal prosecutors. Her elderly parents had sold their Platinum Heights property and moved to Florida to escape the negative publicity associated with Karen's criminal enterprise. As Karen awaited sentencing in federal custody, her jailhouse phone calls continued to provide evidence of her ongoing delusional thinking and complete inability to accept responsibility for her criminal behavior. The recorded calls revealed ongoing attempts to recruit supporters for what she called her political persecution appeal, and her continued belief that celebrity corruption had influenced her prosecution. Meanwhile, the concrete fortress continued serving its function as both practical infrastructure and monument to the consequences of suburban harassment. The structure had become a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach and systematic neighbor harassment, inspiring similar defensive engineering projects in communities across the country. Robert's response to becoming an inadvertent symbol of resistance against suburban terrorism was characteristically generous and community-minded. He established the Neighborhood Defense Foundation, which provided free legal assistance and engineering consultation to families facing systematic harassment from HOA officials or neighbor disputes. The foundation's first major project was developing standardized defensive property modifications that could protect homeowners from vehicle-based attacks, surveillance harassment, and other forms of systematic intimidation. The technical specifications were based on the engineering principles that had made Karen's harassment campaign ineffective while creating comprehensive evidence of her criminal behavior. But the most significant long-term impact of Karen's case was the federal legislation it inspired. The HOA Accountability Act passed Congress with bipartisan support and was signed into law 6 months after Karen's conviction. The law required federal oversight of homeowner associations with histories of harassment complaints and established enhanced criminal penalties for systematic targeting campaigns based on residents' protected characteristics. The law also created federal funding for defensive property engineering projects and legal assistance for harassment victims, ensuring that other families wouldn't face the same systematic intimidation that had plagued Platinum Heights residents under Karen's illegal authority. As Karen prepared for her sentencing hearing while wearing federal prison orange instead of her signature white tennis outfits, the concrete fortress stood as a permanent reminder that superior engineering combined with comprehensive documentation could defeat even the most systematic harassment campaigns while creating lasting legal precedents that protected entire communities from suburban terrorism. Federal Correctional Institution Beaumont smelled like industrial disinfectant and institutional regret when Karen Whitmore arrived wearing federal transport shackles instead of her signature white tennis outfit. Her once perfect blonde highlights now showing 8 months of dark roots that matched the growing darkness of her delusional worldview. But here's the thing about entitled suburban terrorists who discover that federal prison commissaries don't stock designer athletic wear and cellmates aren't impressed by former HOA authority. They either learn humility through comprehensive reality checks or spend their sentences writing increasingly unhinged appeals that federal judges dismiss faster than tennis balls during Wimbledon. The harsh fluorescent lighting that never dimmed made Karen's fading spray tan look like old parchment, while her attempts to maintain superiority among convicted felons created the kind of pathetic spectacle that makes prison psychologists study the intersection of narcissistic personality disorders and institutional adjustment failures. Judge Williams' sentencing hearing had produced what legal scholars would later describe as one of the most comprehensive federal penalties in suburban harassment prosecution history. Karen received 32 years in federal prison, $2.4 million in criminal fines, lifetime supervised release, and mandatory participation in psychological treatment programs designed for defendants with persistent delusional disorders and narcissistic personality traits. Mrs. Whitmore, you organized a systematic campaign of harassment, intimidation, and violence that terrorized multiple families and destroyed community harmony, Judge Williams had explained during the 4-hour sentencing hearing. Your complete lack of remorse, continued threats against victims, and persistent belief that your criminal behavior was justified require maximum federal penalties to protect the community and deter similar crimes. Karen's reaction to her life sentence had provided her final moment of self-incrimination in federal court. This is persecution of honest Americans who dare to maintain community standards against celebrity corruption, she'd screamed while being led away in shackles. History will vindicate my protection of traditional neighborhood values. The statement, broadcast internationally, captured Karen maintaining her delusional belief that systematic harassment constituted legitimate community protection, while federal prosecution represented political persecution rather than legal consequences for documented crimes. Now 2 years into her federal sentence, Karen's prison psychological evaluations revealed not only no improvement in her insight or remorse levels, but active deterioration in her grip on reality. Dr. Rebecca Martinez's quarterly reports described persistent paranoid ideation regarding perceived persecution and complete inability to distinguish between legitimate authority and criminal behavior. Karen's first cellmate, Sandra Williams, had lasted exactly 9 days before requesting emergency transfer due to what she described as constant lectures about celebrity corruption and tennis court maintenance standards. Her second cellmate, Maria Rodriguez, had managed only 3 days before filing formal complaints about Karen's attempts to establish community standards enforcement protocols within their 8x10 cell. Eventually, prison officials had placed Karen in protective custody due to her inability to coexist with other inmates without creating disciplinary problems and safety concerns. Her isolation only reinforced her delusional beliefs about being persecuted for exposing uncomfortable truths about American community governance. Meanwhile, the concrete fortress continued serving its dual purpose as functional infrastructure and educational monument to the consequences of suburban harassment. The structure had become a pilgrimage site for homeowners dealing with HOA disputes, with visitors from across the country stopping to photograph the immovable installation that had ended Karen's vehicular terrorism campaign. Dale Morrison, the contractor who'd built the fortress, reported that his business had received over 400 inquiries from communities dealing with similar harassment problems. We've built 17 similar installations in 6 states, he explained. Apparently, Karen's case inspired a movement of defensive engineering projects designed to protect homeowners from neighbor attacks. The concrete fortress had spawned an entire industry of harassment-resistant property modifications. Engineering firms specializing in defensive residential infrastructure had emerged in markets across the country, offering everything from reinforced mailboxes to vehicle-resistant landscaping designed to protect homeowners from systematic neighbor attacks. Robert's response to becoming an inadvertent symbol of resistance against suburban terrorism had evolved into comprehensive community activism. The Neighborhood Defense Foundation had grown into a national organization providing legal assistance, engineering consultation, and psychological support to families facing systematic harassment from HOA officials or abusive neighbors. The foundation's legal team had handled over 200 cases in its first 2 years, establishing legal precedents that protected homeowners from HOA overreach while providing criminal prosecution support for harassment victims. The engineering division had developed standardized defensive modifications that could be adapted to any residential property facing systematic attacks, but the most significant long-term impact of Karen's case was the federal legislation it had inspired and the comprehensive changes it had brought to HOA oversight nationwide. The HOA Accountability Act had fundamentally transformed community governance by requiring federal monitoring of associations with harassment complaints and establishing enhanced criminal penalties for systematic targeting campaigns. The law had also created the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Community Standards Oversight Division, which investigated HOA abuse complaints and provided federal prosecution support for systematic harassment cases. In its first 18 months, the division had opened investigations into 127 homeowner associations and secured criminal convictions against 43 HOA officials for various forms of systematic harassment and abuse of authority. Karen's case had become the training standard for federal investigators learning to recognize and prosecute suburban harassment campaigns. Her recorded statements, social media posts, and courtroom testimony were used in law enforcement academies as examples of how systematic harassment escalates into federal crimes and how perpetrators often document their own criminal behavior through delusional self-justification. The educational impact extended beyond law enforcement. Karen's case was studied in graduate programs for psychology, criminology, and public administration, as an example of how personality disorders intersect with positions of authority to create systematic abuse situations. Her progression from community leadership to federal prosecution provided a case study in the psychology of suburban terrorism and the institutional failures that enable harassment campaigns. Meanwhile, Platinum Heights had undergone a comprehensive transformation under new HOA leadership that emphasized community harmony, resident rights, and collaborative governance. The new board, led by retired federal judge Patricia Goldman, had implemented policies designed to prevent the kind of systematic harassment that Karen had perpetrated while maintaining appropriate community standards. The community's property values had recovered and exceeded their pre-Karen levels, with real estate agents marketing Platinum Heights as a model for reformed HOA governance and community-centered residential living. The presence of the concrete fortress had become a selling point rather than a detraction, symbolizing the community's commitment to protecting residents from harassment while maintaining aesthetic standards. But Karen's influence continued causing problems even from federal prison. Her jailhouse writings, smuggled out through family visits and published on extremist websites, had attracted a following among suburban conspiracy theorists, who viewed her case as evidence of systematic persecution of traditional community leaders by celebrity-controlled government agencies. The writings, which prison officials monitored but couldn't prevent under First Amendment protections, revealed Karen's continuing evolution from delusional harassment into comprehensive paranoid ideology. Her essays combined community governance theory with conspiracy theories about celebrity influence, government corruption, and the systematic destruction of traditional American neighborhood values. One particularly disturbing essay, titled The Concrete Fortress Conspiracy: How Celebrity Terrorism Destroyed Community Democracy, claimed that Robert Redford's defensive installation was actually a federally funded psychological warfare project designed to intimidate honest community leaders into submission. The essay had been shared thousands of times on social media platforms dedicated to HOA resistance and suburban sovereignty movements. Martinez's final psychological evaluation before Karen's first parole review concluded that she remained a significant danger to community safety and showed no capacity for rehabilitation or insight into her criminal behavior. Subject continues to exhibit severe narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid features and persistent delusional thinking about her conviction. Shows no empathy for victims, maintains belief in conspiracy theories about her prosecution, and continues planning what she describes as community protection activities upon release. Prognosis for successful reintegration into society remains extremely poor. The Parole Review Board, faced with Dr. Martinez's recommendations and Karen's continued writings about resuming community protection duties, denied her application and scheduled her next review for 15 years later. Legal experts predicted that Karen would serve her full 32-year sentence due to her persistent delusional thinking and ongoing implicit threats against the communities she might target upon release. Karen's family had completely severed contact with her after her sister Patricia received threatening letters from prison describing her as a traitor to community values and promising accountability for family members who collaborate with celebrity corruption. Patricia had moved to another state and changed her name to escape association with Karen's criminal activities and ongoing extremist writings. The civil lawsuit settlements had exceeded $25 million, requiring liquidation of all Karen assets, including her Platinum Heights mansion, which had been purchased by a young family who appreciated both the property's architectural features and its symbolic significance in the community's recovery from systematic harassment. The insurance companies that had covered Karen's policies had successfully recovered most of their losses through subrogation claims and asset seizures, but the legal precedents established by her case had led to industry-wide policy changes excluding coverage for systematic harassment activities and HOA abuse of authority. Meanwhile, the concrete fortress had evolved beyond its original defensive purpose into a symbol of community resilience and effective resistance against suburban terrorism. The structure had been designated as a historic landmark by the local Preservation Society, with a bronze plaque commemorating its role in ending systematic harassment and inspiring nationwide HOA reform legislation. The plaque's inscription read, "This structure stands as a monument to the principle that superior engineering combined with comprehensive documentation can defeat systematic harassment while creating lasting legal precedents that protect entire communities from suburban terrorism. Dedicated to all families who refuse to be intimidated by neighbor harassment and HOA abuse of authority." Annual memorial services were held at the concrete fortress on the anniversary of Karen's final arrest, with community leaders, harassment victims, and defensive engineering professionals gathering to celebrate the transformation of one woman's criminal obsession into comprehensive legal and social reforms that had protected thousands of families nationwide. As I concluded my documentation of this case while preparing the final report for the Neighborhood Defense Foundation's legal archive, I reflected on the mathematical precision of consequences in Karen's story. She had started with petty harassment over garbage placement, escalated through systematic criminal behavior and federal civil rights violations, and ended with a life sentence in federal prison, while inspiring nationwide reforms that would protect future communities from similar harassment campaigns. But more importantly, her criminal enterprise had accidentally created positive changes that extended far beyond individual victim compensation. Federal prosecutors had gained new tools for handling suburban harassment cases. Engineering professionals had developed innovative defensive technologies. Communities had received enhanced legal protections and oversight mechanisms that prevented systematic abuse of HOA authority. Karen Whitmore had intended to maintain her vision of community standards through systematic harassment and intimidation of residents who challenged her authority. Instead, she had accidentally created the most comprehensive protection system for homeowner rights in American legal history while destroying her own life through criminal behavior that she continued to justify through delusional thinking and extremist ideology. The lesson was clear and permanent. Suburban harassment has federal consequences that don't disappear when you convince yourself that systematic terrorism constitutes legitimate community protection. Federal prosecutors, federal judges, and federal prisons don't care about your HOA authority, your tennis club memberships, or your theories about celebrity corruption when you commit crimes against your neighbor's constitutional rights. As Karen continued serving her sentence in federal prison, wearing orange jumpsuits instead of white tennis outfits, and writing manifestos that courts and parole boards routinely dismissed as evidence of ongoing dangerousness, the concrete fortress continued standing as a testament to the principle that some problems require solutions that combine defensive engineering with comprehensive legal action to protect communities from the kind of systematic harassment that transforms neighborhood governance into suburban terrorism. The 10th anniversary of Karen Whitmore's federal conviction arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made Platinum Heights look like a postcard advertisement for reformed community governance. But the woman who'd once terrorized residents over garbage placement was spending her commemorative day in federal prison, writing increasingly unhinged manifestos about tennis court maintenance standards and celebrity corruption conspiracies. The transformation was mathematically precise in its completeness. Karen had traded her white tennis outfits for permanent orange prison uniforms, her HOA authority for lifetime federal supervision, and her luxury mansion for an 8x10 cell that she shared with institutional fluorescent lighting and persistent delusions about being a political prisoner rather than a convicted suburban terrorist. Federal Correctional Institution Beaumont's psychological evaluation reports painted a devastating picture of Karen's decade-long mental deterioration. Dr. Sarah Chen's comprehensive assessment described persistent paranoid schizophrenia with grandiose delusions and complete detachment from reality regarding the criminal nature of her harassment activities. Karen's condition had progressed beyond simple narcissistic personality disorder into full psychotic break characterized by elaborate conspiracy theories involving federal agencies, celebrity protection networks, and systematic persecution of traditional community leaders. Karen's prison writings had evolved from simple complaints about prosecution to comprehensive manifestos that combined community governance theory with elaborate conspiracy narratives. Her latest essay, The Concrete Fortress Plot, A Decade of Federal Terrorism Against American Neighborhoods, claimed that her imprisonment was part of a systematic campaign to destroy community self-governance through celebrity-controlled psychological warfare operations. The 847-page manifesto, which prison officials allowed under First Amendment protections but monitored for security threats, revealed Karen's complete inability to distinguish between her criminal harassment campaign and legitimate community protection activities. She described her vehicular attacks on Robert's property as necessary enforcement actions against federal property modification conspiracies and characterized the concrete fortress as an illegal military installation designed to intimidate honest Americans. But Karen's most disturbing evolution was her recruitment of followers among extremist groups focused on suburban sovereignty and HOA resistance movements. Her writings had attracted attention from anti-government organizations that viewed her case as evidence of federal overreach and celebrity-controlled persecution of traditional American values. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Domestic Terrorism Division had classified Karen's prison communications as Category 2 extremist recruitment materials due to their potential for inspiring copycat harassment campaigns and anti-government violence. Her essays were being monitored by terrorism analysts who tracked their distribution through online platforms dedicated to suburban conspiracy theories and HOA resistance ideology. Meanwhile, Robert Redford's response to becoming an inadvertent symbol of resistance against suburban terrorism had evolved into one of the most significant community activism initiatives of his legendary career. The Neighborhood Defense Foundation had grown into a $50 million organization providing comprehensive support to harassment victims, while funding research into the psychology of suburban terrorism and community governance reform. The Foundation's legal division had secured criminal convictions against 167 HOA officials for systematic harassment, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations. Their engineering division had developed defensive property modifications now used in over 3,000 communities nationwide. Most importantly, their advocacy work had inspired federal legislation that fundamentally transformed community governance oversight and resident protection mechanisms. The Robert Redford Community Protection Act, signed into law on the 5th anniversary of Karen's conviction, established federal criminal penalties for systematic HOA harassment and created the Department of Justice's Community Standards Enforcement Division. The law required federal background checks for HOA board candidates, mandatory civil rights training for community officials, and enhanced criminal penalties for harassment campaigns targeting residents based on protected characteristics. But the most significant long-term impact was the transformation of Platinum Heights from a community terrorized by systematic harassment into a national model for collaborative residential governance. Under the leadership of retired federal judge Patricia Goldman, the community had implemented policies that emphasized resident rights, transparent decision-making, and conflict resolution through mediation rather than enforcement. The concrete fortress had become the centerpiece of what residents called Liberation Park, a community gathering space that honored victims of HOA harassment while celebrating the legal and social reforms that had emerged from Karen's criminal prosecution. The park featured educational displays about resident rights, defensive engineering principles, and the federal legislation that had been inspired by one woman's decade-long terrorism campaign. Annual memorial services at the Concrete Fortress drew visitors from across the country, including harassment victims, legal advocates, and engineering professionals who gathered to celebrate the transformation of suburban terrorism into comprehensive community protection systems. The services featured speakers who'd been inspired by Karen's case to pursue careers in civil rights law, defensive engineering, or community activism. The most moving testimony came from the families who'd been systematically harassed by Karen before her final arrest. Margaret Chen, now in her 80s, spoke about the psychological impact of living under constant surveillance and threats, while praising the legal precedents that had protected subsequent generations of homeowners from similar harassment. Karen Whitmore tried to destroy our community through systematic intimidation and criminal behavior, Margaret explained to the assembled crowd. But her actions accidentally created the strongest protection system for homeowner rights in American history. Every family that now lives free from HOA harassment owes their safety to the legal precedents established by her prosecution. The economic impact of Karen's case had been equally transformative. The defensive engineering industry that had emerged from her harassment campaign now employed over 2,000 professionals in specialties ranging from reinforced landscaping design to harassment-resistant property modifications. The industry generated over $200 million annually in revenue while providing practical protection to communities facing systematic neighbor harassment. Dale Morrison's company, which had built the original concrete fortress, had expanded into a national corporation specializing in defensive residential infrastructure. Their standardized harassment-resistant modifications were now available through major home improvement retailers, making protection from systematic neighbor attacks accessible to families of all economic levels. Karen's case proved that superior engineering combined with comprehensive documentation could defeat even the most persistent harassment campaigns, Dale explained during a conference on defensive property design. We've taken those principles and created an industry dedicated to protecting American families from the kind of suburban terrorism that she represented. The psychological research inspired by Karen's case had revolutionized understanding of suburban harassment and community-based terrorism. Dr. Rebecca Martinez's longitudinal study of HOA abuse patterns had identified early warning signs that allowed communities to intervene before harassment campaigns escalated into criminal behavior. The study's findings had been incorporated into community governance training programs used by over 4,000 homeowner associations nationwide. The training emphasized collaborative decision-making, conflict resolution, and recognition of harassment patterns that could indicate potential criminal behavior by community officials. But perhaps the most significant transformation was Robert Redford's personal evolution from harassment victim to leading advocate for community protection and residential rights. At 88, he dedicated his later years to ensuring that no other families would face the kind of systematic intimidation that had required defensive engineering solutions and federal prosecution to resolve. His final film project, a documentary titled The Concrete Fortress: How One Woman's Harassment Created a Movement, had won Academy Awards for Best Documentary Feature and had been viewed by over 100 million people worldwide. The film combined Karen's story with broader examination of suburban harassment, community governance reform, and the legal precedents that had emerged from her prosecution. The documentary's most powerful moment was Robert's personal testimony about the impact of systematic harassment on his ability to enjoy retirement in peace. No one should have to fortify their home against neighbors who mistake authority for the right to terrorize other people, he explained in the film's conclusion. Karen Whitmore's criminal behavior accidentally created the tools that other families need to protect themselves from similar harassment. That's her only positive contribution to American community life. Meanwhile, Karen's parole reviews continued to be denied due to her persistent delusional thinking and ongoing threats against the communities she might target upon release. Her latest psychological evaluation described complete inability to distinguish between criminal harassment and legitimate authority, and persistent planning of what she describes as community protection activities that clearly constitute threats of future criminal behavior. Prison officials had documented Karen's attempts to recruit fellow inmates for what she called suburban resistance cells, designed to restore traditional community governance through harassment campaigns targeting celebrity-corrupted neighborhoods. The recruitment efforts had resulted in additional charges for conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism and had extended her potential release date by an additional 15 years. As Karen approached her 15th year in federal prison, still wearing orange jumpsuits instead of white tennis outfits, and still writing manifestos that federal judges dismissed as evidence of ongoing dangerousness, the concrete fortress continued standing as a permanent monument to the principle that systematic harassment has permanent consequences for perpetrators while creating lasting protections for future victims. The lesson was comprehensive and mathematically precise. Suburban terrorism disguised as community governance creates federal criminal liability that extends far beyond individual prison sentences to include comprehensive social and legal reforms that protect entire generations of families from similar harassment campaigns. Karen Whitmore had intended to maintain her vision of community standards through systematic intimidation of residents who challenged her authority. Instead, she had accidentally created the most comprehensive protection system for residential rights in American legal history, while transforming herself from a tennis club queen into a federal prisoner whose only legacy was the legal and social reforms that had emerged from prosecuting her criminal enterprise. The war between Karen's harassment campaign and Robert's right to peaceful enjoyment of his property had ended with complete victory for civil rights, community protection, and the principle that superior engineering combined with comprehensive legal action could defeat even the most systematic suburban terrorism while creating lasting precedents that protected millions of American families from similar harassment campaigns. As visitors continued gathering at the concrete fortress to celebrate another anniversary of Karen's arrest and conviction, the structure stood unchanged and immovable, serving its original function as a garbage container, while symbolizing the more important truth that some problems require solutions that combine practical engineering with moral courage to protect communities from the kind of systematic harassment that transforms ordinary neighbors into suburban terrorists who must be stopped through whatever means necessary to preserve the peace and safety that every American family deserves in their own home.